"Who baked these biscuits?" Cole Mercer didn't say it loud. He said it the way a man says something when the ground shifts under his boots and he's not sure yet if he's falling. He set the biscuit down, picked it up again, took another bite so slow it was almost reverent. Around him, 6 other cowboys shoveled food like it was a chore. Not one of them had noticed. Not one of them had even paused. Cole noticed, and that was the beginning of everything. If this story already has its hooks in you, subscribe to our channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The biscuits were gone before the last man sat down. That was the rule at Red Creek Way Station. Not a written rule, not a spoken one, but a rule kept with the consistency of weather and gravity. The food appeared. The men ate. The plates were cleared. And somewhere behind the partition wall, past the smoke-blackened stovepipe and the row of iron hooks, where cast pans hung like sleeping things, a woman moved in silence and made it all happen. Nobody thought about that part. Nobody except Cole Mercer, and he hadn't thought about it either. Not until that Tuesday in late October, when he bit into a biscuit that stopped him cold. He'd pulled off the Laramie Trail after 3 days of hard driving. 1,200 head of cattle, 2 wranglers with cracked lips and bad tempers, and a supply wagon with a wheel that had been threatening to give since Bitter Creek. He was tired down to the bone, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and makes everything look gray. He'd eaten at Red Creek before. The food was fine, serviceable. Nothing to write home about. He sat at the long plank table, 3rd seat from the left, same as always. Pete Donner, one of his outriders, was already 3 bites into a bowl of beef stew, talking with his mouth full about a horse he'd seen in Cheyenne. The other men strangers, drifters, a pair of freighters heading west, ate with their hats still on and their eyes on their plates. Cole picked up the biscuit from the tin bread basket without looking at it. He bit in, and then he did look. Down at what remained in his hand, the interior still steaming, faintly layered like good shale. Soft, not gummy, not dry, with a crust that had actual character, slightly salted, almost sweet underneath. And something else he couldn't name. Something that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen in Missouri when he was 7 years old before everything went hard. He set it down. He looked around the table. Pete was still talking about the horse. The freighters were arguing about road conditions south of Rollins. Nobody had paused. Nobody was experiencing what he was experiencing, which was the sudden bewildering sensation that someone had cared about this biscuit. Had thought about it. Had attended to it with a kind of deliberate attention that cost something. He picked it up again and finished it slowly. Then he looked toward the kitchen partition. He couldn't see anyone. Just the edge of the stove, the near corner of a shelf loaded with jars, and the flicker of firelight on a low ceiling. He could hear movement quiet, efficient, unhurried. The sound of someone who knew exactly where everything was and needed no extra motion to accomplish anything. He thought about asking the station boy, the pimple-faced kid named Denny, who refilled the coffee, who had made the bread. But by the time Denny came back around, Pete was talking to him about something, and Cole let the moment pass. He told himself it didn't matter. He ate 2 more biscuits and drank his coffee and went to sleep in the station's bunk room and was back on the trail before dawn. But he thought about those biscuits for the next 4 days. That was the first time. The second time Cole Mercer came to Red Creek Way Station, it was 3 weeks later on a supply run he could have sent any hand to manage. He told himself the road past Red Creek saved half a day compared to the Sweetwater cutoff. That was true enough technically. He didn't examine it further. He sat at the same table. 3rd seat from the left. The stew was good. The coffee was strong. And then the biscuits came out a fresh tin set down by old Denny without comment, and Cole felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even known was tight. Same layered texture. Same almost sweet depth. Same crust with its faint, deliberate saltiness. He ate 3. This time he watched the partition more carefully. He caught a glimpse, just a glimpse, the edge of a shoulder, dark cotton sleeve, the side of a woman's face. Her hair pinned back with the determined tidiness of someone who couldn't afford loose ends. She was refilling something. turning back to the stove before he could see more. Moving with that same quality, he'd registered the first time economy competence absolute absence of wasted motion. She didn't come out to the table. Denny handled all of it. Cole turned back to his plate. At the end of the meal, he stopped Denny as the boy cleared the bread tin. "Who does the cooking here?" Denny blinked at him like no one had ever asked. "Miss Whitfield." "She been here long?" "About 2 years, I think." The boy shrugged. "Maybe more." "She the one who makes the biscuits?" Denny looked at the tin in his hand, then back at Cole like the question barely computed. "I reckon. She makes everything." He walked away. Cole sat with his coffee and turned the name over quietly. Whitfield. Mara Whitfield had been at Red Creek Way Station for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the exact count without trying. The way a person keeps count of a sentence they're serving, not with bitterness necessarily, but with the clarity of someone who does not confuse survival with contentment. She had come to Red Creek after her mother died. Before that, there had been a brief failed chapter in a town called Harlow's Crossing, a seamstress job that paid almost nothing, a rooming house that cost slightly more than almost nothing, and a winter that made the arithmetic work out very badly. Red Creek had been an answer to a letter she'd written in desperation to a man named Harlan Pruitt, who ran the station and had put a notice in 3 different territorial papers looking for a cook. She had offered her services for a wage that was already modest by any standard. Pruitt had hired her by return post without asking for a reference. That should have told her something. The work was relentless in the way that only frontier service work is relentless. Not dramatic, not varied, but grinding in its repetition, beginning before light and ending long after dark, with no defined boundary between labor and existence. Mara cooked 3 meals a day for whoever came through, which on busy weeks meant feeding 30 men across all meals, and on slow weeks meant feeding 8. She kept the kitchen inventory, directed the supply orders when Pruitt allowed it, managed the bread schedule, smoked the meat, when the weather permitted, kept the root cellar organized and maintained. The sourdough starter, her mother's starter, 16 years old, carried from Abilene in a clay crock packed in a flour sack, with the same faithfulness she brought to everything she cared about. She was also, for all practical purposes, invisible, not in any dramatic way. No one was cruel to her. No one threatened her. She was simply absent from the consciousness of almost everyone who passed through. The men ate her food and did not know her name. The freighters complimented the stew to Pruitt, who accepted the compliment with the comfortable confidence of a man who had done nothing to earn it. Travelers from the east sometimes asked Denny if there was a cook on the premises, and Denny sometimes said yes, and sometimes forgot to mention it at all. Pruitt called her Miss Whitfield when he needed something adjusted. Otherwise, he communicated through notes left on the kitchen shelf. More salt pork for Friday party of 12. Expected Thursday. Reduce the bread ration until the flour shipment arrives. Mara read the notes. Mara managed. Mara made it work. And every morning before anyone else was awake, she fed the sourdough starter. Talked to it a little under her breath, the way her mother had taught her. You need to be tended same as anything else worth keeping, and felt in that small daily ritual, the only continuous thread back to a life that had once contained warmth and meaning and someone who had known her name. She did not think of herself as suffering. She thought of herself as waiting, though she could not have named what she was waiting for. Cole came back a 3rd time in November. This time the weather was bad sleet off the Medicine Bow Range, the kind of horizontal sleet that finds every gap in a coat. He came in with 2 of his men, and they were all gray with cold. Denny had the fire burning high, and the table was set, and before Cole had even unwrapped his hands from his coat, the smell hit him. Bread. Specifically, that bread. He felt warmth spread through his chest before the fire had a chance to do it. He sat down. His men flanked him, slapping their palms together, arguing about whether the sleet would freeze before morning. The food came out stew again, rich and dark with vegetables Cole couldn't identify by sight, but could by taste. Someone who knew how to build depth with what was available, and then the biscuit tin placed at the center of the table by Denny with his usual indifference. Cole reached for one. And then the partition moved. Not dramatically. Not an entrance. The woman simply stepped through the gap to retrieve a serving bowl that Denny had set on the wrong counter, and for a moment she was visible, fully visible, standing not 8 feet from where Cole sat. He looked at her with the attentiveness he usually reserved for horses and terrain. She was young. He hadn't expected young. 24 maybe, 25, with brown hair that had been pinned up probably 6 hours ago and had been slowly escaping ever since. Her dress was dark cotton, practical, dusted with flour at the hip and the cuff. Her hands, when she picked up the bowl, were the hands of someone who worked them hard, capable, slightly rough-moving, with the same economy he'd registered in every sound he'd ever heard from the kitchen. Her face was not pretty exactly in the way that word gets used loosely. But there was something in it that stopped him. A focused quality. A kind of contained intelligence that watched the room the way a good rancher watches weather, taking information in without drama, calculating constantly, showing nothing. She picked up the bowl. She turned back toward the partition. She did not look at the table, at Cole, at anyone. She moved with the confidence of someone who had learned very thoroughly that no one was going to look at her, and had made a separate peace with that knowledge. She was gone in under 5 seconds. Cole sat with a biscuit in his hand and realized his men had been talking to him for at least 30 seconds, and he hadn't heard a word. Cole, his wrangler, a lean man named Bard, was looking at him. "Said you think the sleet freezes tonight." "Probably," Cole said, and took a bite of his biscuit, and thought about a woman who moved through a room full of men like she was already somewhere else. He came back 2 weeks later. He didn't make excuses to himself this time. He simply came back. He ate his meal, and at the end of it, when Denny came to clear, Cole said quietly, "Tell Miss Whitfield the biscuits are the best I've had since Missouri." Denny stared at him. "Just tell her," Cole said. Denny went. Cole watched the gap in the partition. He didn't expect anything. He was not a man who expected much from the world, which was partly why the world had treated him as well as it had low expectations. Occasional satisfaction, rare, genuine surprise. He got a genuine surprise. After a moment from beyond the partition, he heard a sound. Short. Barely a sound at all, really. More like the controlled exhale of someone who had just received something so unexpected they had to adjust the air in their lungs to account for it. Then, nothing. Cole left his payment on the table and put on his coat and went out into the cold. He came back the following week. By December, Cole Mercer had eaten at Red Creek Way Station 7 times in 6 weeks. Bard noticed on the 4th trip and said nothing. On the 5th trip, Bard made a quiet comment about the road to Sweetwater being faster, and Cole said the road to Sweetwater was harder on the horses in this cold, which was not entirely untrue, and that was the end of that. He had learned to time his arrival for the period between the noon rush, such as it was usually freighters and trail hands heading north, and the evening sitting when the station was quiet, and he could eat in relative peace. During those in-between hours, the kitchen sounds were different, less urgent, more like thought than action. He could hear Mara moving in the deliberate, unhurried way of someone doing things correctly, rather than quickly. The slow simmer, the careful fold. The particular weight of someone pressing bread dough with their palms. He hadn't spoken to her directly. She never came out during the quiet hours. But twice now, she had sent something out with Denny that wasn't part of the standard menu. Once a small dish of honey butter that appeared beside his bread tin without explanation. And once, during a particularly bitter cold snap, a cup of something that turned out to be spiced cider, hand-delivered by a mortified Denny, who had clearly been instructed to say nothing and simply place it in front of the tall man in the far seat. Cole had drunk the cider slowly, looking at the partition. He had thought, "She sees me," which was interesting because he had come originally because he saw her. The evening in early December that changed things, really changed them. Snap something from a slow roll into a hard run began without drama. Cole arrived at 4:30. Denny took his coat. The station was nearly empty, just a pair of land surveyors at the far end of the table, papers spread between their plates, arguing about meridian lines. Cole sat at his usual place. He heard Pruitt before he saw him. The station owner's voice carried a self-satisfied weight, even through walls, the voice of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy whatever space he was in. Need the kitchen running earlier. 5 o'clock in the morning, I mean it this time. I'm getting complaints that the morning riders aren't finding food ready before 6. Cole didn't look toward the back hallway where the voice was coming from. He looked at his hands on the table. Mara's voice came back, controlled, quieter, but audible to Cole in the silence of the nearly empty room. I'm already starting at 5:30, Mr. Pruitt. To move it earlier, I'd need to... I don't need to hear about your schedule, Pruitt said. I need the food ready. That's what you're paid for. A pause. Yes, sir. Also, I'm adjusting the December wage. Station revenue's been soft. I'm taking it down 15% through the new year. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence Cole had heard in that building before. It was the silence of something being endured. That would put me at, Mara began. At what your output justifies, Pruitt said. You're a cook, Miss Whitfield, not a partner. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was precisely the same as before. No crack, no waver. Understood. Pruitt's footsteps crossed back toward his office. A door closed. Cole sat very still. Beside him, the land surveyors continued their argument about meridian lines, unaware that anything had occurred. Cole looked at his untouched food. He looked at the partition. He thought about the honey butter that had appeared without explanation. The cider on a cold night. The biscuits. God, the biscuits made by a woman who started at 5:30 in the morning and was told her output didn't justify her wage by a man who wouldn't recognize output if it came and shook his hand. He thought about economy of motion, about care expressed through action rather than noise, about what it cost a person to be invisible for years at a time. He ate his meal. He waited until the surveyors left. Then he said without raising his voice, Miss Whitfield. Nothing from the kitchen. I know you can hear me, he said. I don't want anything. He stopped, started again. I've been eating here since October, 7 times. Maybe 8. And every time I come in, something's better than it should be. Better than this place deserves. He paused. You deserve better than this place deserves. Silence. Then from behind the partition, very quiet. You don't know anything about what I deserve, Mr. Mercer, he said. Cole Mercer. I run Mercer Ridge east of the Laramie Fork. A beat of silence. Mr. Mercer? I know enough, he said. I know what good work looks like. I know what it sounds like. I know what it tastes like. He took a breath. And I know what it looks like when good work is being paid for badly by someone who doesn't understand what he has. Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, there was something fractionally different in her voice. Not warmth exactly, but something that had been very firmly closed, that had opened one careful inch. What is it you want, Mr. Mercer? Nothing tonight, he said. Tonight I just wanted to say it. He left his payment on the table, exact price of the meal, plus an amount that was not a tip in any standard sense, just a correction, and put on his coat, and walked out into the December dark. He sat in his saddle for a moment before he rode. He thought about Mara Whitfield standing on the other side of a partition wall, having just been told by a stranger she'd barely glimpsed, whose name she'd just learned that someone had noticed her. He wondered what that felt like. He suspected from the quality of that silence that it had felt like something very large arriving, very unexpectedly, in a life that had not expected large things. He rode home through the cold, and for the first time in years, Cole Mercer was not thinking about the ranch, the cattle, the winter supply chain, or any of the 100 practical things that ordinarily occupied every available corner of his mind. He was thinking about a woman who made biscuits the way some people write letters with everything that mattered said between the lines for anyone patient enough to read them. He was going to have to go back. He already knew that, The only question was what he was going to say when he did. 3 days later, a bitter wind dropped the temperature to 15 below, and Cole Mercer did something he had not done since acquiring Mercer Ridge. He sent his supply wagon ahead without him and rode the Red Creek Road alone, arriving at the way station at 2 in the afternoon, with no reasonable excuse and no real attempt to construct one. He sat down at his table. He ate. And this time, when the kitchen sounds slowed and the station emptied in the mid-afternoon lull, he heard the partition move, not Denny's shuffle. Someone else's step measured deliberate the step of someone who had made a decision and intended to follow through with it. Mara Whitfield came around the partition's edge with a cloth in her hands, the kind of purposeless task people invent when they want to appear casual about something they are not casual about at all. She went to the far end of the table, straightened a tin that didn't need straightening, then looked at him across the empty length of the plank table. She was smaller than he'd registered from the glimpses 5'4", at most slightly built, with the kind of posture that comes not from ease, but from intention. Her eyes were gray, the specific gray of an overcast sky that has weather in it. She said, "Mercer Ridge is 30 miles from here." "About that," Cole said. "That's a long ride for a meal." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him steadily. "Why do you keep coming back?" He could have said something smooth. He was not a smooth man. "Because you're the best cook between Laramie and Rollins," he said, "and because 3 days ago you heard something from Pruitt that you shouldn't have had to hear, and because I've been riding past this station for 2 years without stopping, and I think I made a mistake about that." Her chin lifted very slightly. It was not a defensive gesture. It was the gesture of someone adjusting their weight when they feel unexpected ground beneath their feet. "You've been riding past for 2 years, when the trail went this direction, and you never stopped." "I had my own problems," he said. "Ranch was half-built. Hard years." He paused. "No excuse. Good work is good work. I should have been paying attention sooner." She looked at him for a long moment. "Nobody talks to me like that," she said. Not an accusation. More like a data point she was trying to fit into a system that hadn't accounted for it. "Like what?" "Like what I think matters." Cole picked up the last biscuit from the tin, held it up slightly. "Everything you make matters," he said. "That's not me being polite. That's me telling you a fact." He set it down. "A person who works like you, work Miss Whitfield, that's rare. That's the kind of rare that shouldn't be wasted on a man who leaves notes on a shelf and can't be troubled to learn your name." She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have weather in it. Then she said carefully, "I don't know what you want from me, Mr. Mercer." "Right now, nothing." He met her eyes. "I want you to know that someone noticed. That's all. The rest can wait." She looked at him for 3 more seconds, counting, he thought, measuring the way a careful person measures before they trust. Then she turned and went back behind the partition. But she hadn't said no, and Cole Mercer, riding home through the dark and the cold with the wind at his back and his mind running at a gallop, understood that in the particular silence of Mara Whitfield, a thing that hadn't said no was something close to everything. He came back on a Thursday. Mara knew it was him. Before Denny said a word, knew it by the sound of the door, the specific weight of boots on the plank floor, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who had decided where he was going and saw no reason to apologize for it. She stood at the stove and did not turn around. She listened to him settle into his chair, 3rd seat from the left, same as always, and she told herself it meant nothing. A man returning to a place where the food was good, that was ordinary, that happened all the time. She told herself that and went back to her bread. But her hands were pressing the dough a little harder than necessary, and she knew it, and she was annoyed at herself for knowing it. Denny brought Cole his coffee. Mara heard the cup set down, heard Cole say, "Thank you." The way he always said it, quiet, genuine, like he meant it for the specific person and not just for the service. She had noticed that about him on his 3rd visit before she'd ever seen his face clearly. The way he thanked Denny. the way most men at that table didn't. Small things. She had learned to read small things because large things were rarely offered. She shaped the biscuits and slid them into the oven and wiped her hands on her apron and told herself she was not listening for him. Then she listened for him anyway, standing very still at the far counter with a jar of preserves she didn't actually need. He was talking to no one, just drinking his coffee. She heard the cup set down, picked up, set down again. Patient. Like a man comfortable with silence because he'd made a separate peace with it a long time ago. She understood that kind of peace. She lived in it herself. When Denny went back out with the bread tin, Mara thought about what Cole had said 3 days ago. Thought about the specific way he'd held up that biscuit, not as a compliment, not as performance, but as evidence. Everything you make matters. She had turned those words over in the quiet of the last 3 nights, the way you turn something unfamiliar in your hands, testing its weight, checking its edges, trying to determine whether it was the real thing or a very convincing substitute. She had not yet decided. She pulled the biscuits from the oven, loaded the tin, told Denny to take them out, then stood in her kitchen and breathed. Tunt. He stayed longer than usual that Thursday. The noon crowd came and went, 4 freighters heading north, a pair of circuit riders, a family in a farm wagon who ate quickly and spoke to no one. Cole ate his meal and nursed his coffee and didn't leave. Mara moved through the kitchen cleanup with the particular awareness of someone who is pretending very hard not to be aware of something. At 1:30, when the station had gone quiet and Denny was out splitting wood, Cole said, "The preserves were blackberry." Mara stopped. "Last month," he said. "With the morning bread. Blackberry with something else in it. Cardamom, maybe." She came to the edge of the partition. Not all the way out, just enough to look at him. "Cardamom and a little orange peel," she said. "The orange came off a freight shipment that was going soft. I bought the rinds for almost nothing." He nodded slowly. "Smart." "Practical," she corrected. "Same thing sometimes." She looked at him across the room. He was watching her the same way she'd caught him watching before. Not aggressive, not presumptuous, just attentive in a way that had depth behind it, like there was actual thought going into what he was seeing. "You rode 30 miles again," she said. 28 by the East Fork. "That's not a correction that helps your case, Mr. Mercer." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." She should have gone back to the kitchen. She knew she should. Instead, she said, "How long have you had the ranch?" 6 years, he said. "Bought the first parcel from a man who ran out of faith in it. Added the east section 3 years later. It's a working operation now. 12 hands. 1,100 head through the summer, fewer in winter. 12 hands to feed," she said. "Cookie Dawes handles the cook wagon on drives. For the ranch house we manage." He paused. "We manage badly, if I'm honest." "What does badly mean?" "It means Bard learned one stew recipe 8 years ago and has been remaking it ever since. It means the men have stopped complaining because complaining didn't change anything." He looked at her. "It means the bunkhouse smells like scorched beans more mornings than not." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What kind of oven does the ranch house have?" He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him look caught off guard. "Cast iron. Big one. Good draft." "Flour supply?" "We order from Rollins, sometimes Laramie." "Sourdough or quick bread?" I genuinely don't know," he said. "Bard buys the yeast packets, I think." Mara absorbed this. "Yeast packets," she repeated with the controlled tone of a professional confronted with an unnecessary tragedy. "I take it that's not ideal." "It's not wrong," she said carefully. "It's just not what you'd use if you had another option." He looked at her steadily. "What other option would you use?" She recognized the question for what it was. She let it sit between them for a moment, acknowledged and unanswered, and then said, "I should get back to the kitchen," and returned behind the partition. But she was aware for the rest of that afternoon of a feeling she hadn't had in 2 years, 4 months, and she counted quickly 14 days. The feeling of being in a conversation. A real one. The kind where both people were actually present, and both people were actually listening, and the space between the words was doing work. She hadn't known how much she missed it until it was there again. He came back on Saturday. Mara had not told herself he would. She had not planned for it. And yet, somehow, when she heard the door at noon and recognized the weight of his footfall, she was not surprised. She was, and this she examined briefly and filed away, without drama, something closer to settled. Like a room that had been slightly off balance, suddenly finding its level. This time he brought something. Not flowers. Not anything sentimental. He'd stopped at the Mercantile in Lander on his way through. She learned this later and bought a half-pound of good cardamom whole pods, the real thing expensive enough that Denny's eyes went a little wide when he relayed that it was a gift from the man at table 3. Mara held the packet and didn't move for a moment. Nobody had ever, not in 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days, brought her anything that was connected to what she actually did, what she actually cared about, what she actually was. She set it on the shelf above the stove precisely where she could see it. She didn't go out to the table. She wasn't ready for that yet. But when Denny went out with the coffee refill, she sent along a second biscuit tin. One she'd set aside the ones from this morning's second batch, which were better than the first, because she'd added a small adjustment to the fat ratio, something she'd been considering for a week. Denny reported back that the man at table 3 had eaten 4 of them and sat very still for a moment after the last one, the way a person sits when something has moved them and they are deciding whether to show it. Mara went back to her stove. She was smiling before she knew she was doing it. She stopped when she noticed, but not as quickly as she should have. By the 3rd week of December, Cole Mercer had been to Red Creek 9 times. He had repaired the broken hinge on the exterior kitchen door without being asked, without announcing he was going to do it, and without mentioning it afterward. Mara had come in one morning to find the door swinging clean and straight, the old pin replaced with a new one, the wood around the frame reseated properly. Denny didn't know who'd done it. Cole wasn't at the station that day, but there was a fresh boot print in the mud at the kitchen entrance, and the hardware was quality, the kind of quality a man bought at a proper smithy, not the general store. She ran her finger along the new hinge, tested the swing of it. She thought he was here before dawn, before anyone was up. He came specifically for this. He said nothing about it and asked for nothing in return. She thought about that for the rest of the day. A week later, she noticed the woodpile outside the kitchen entrance had been reorganized. The wet wood pulled to the outside. The dry wood stacked close where she could reach it, without going far in the cold. The whole pile reorganized with the logic of someone who understood that whoever used it was doing so under time pressure in bad weather with her hands already full. Nobody reorganized wood piles for her. Nobody thought about whether she could reach the dry wood. She mentioned it to Denny. Denny said he hadn't touched the wood pile. She stood at the kitchen entrance and looked at the neatly stacked wood and felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise word for. It was adjacent to gratitude, but not quite gratitude, because gratitude implied a gift given once. This was different. This was ongoing attention. The kind that noticed what was hard and did something about it quietly, without theater, without requiring acknowledgement. She had not known until that moment, standing at the woodpile, how profoundly she had been starved of that kind of attention. She went back inside and worked through the rest of her morning with a tightness behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the smoke from the stove. Cole came in 2 days later, and she was waiting for him. Not in the way of someone who had rehearsed something she hadn't. But she was standing at the edge of the partition when he came through the door, and he stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the room. "The woodpile," she said. He said nothing. "And the door hinge." Still nothing. His expression was the same as always, steady quiet, not a man who performed innocence. "You could have told me," she said. "I didn't do it so you'd thank me," he said. "I did it because it needed doing." That's not a normal reason," she said. It seems like the obvious one to me. She looked at him. He looked back. The room was empty except for old Denny at the far end, refilling oil lamps, and he had the hearing of a man who'd spent years listening to things he wasn't supposed to repeat, which meant he heard everything and filed it and moved on. Why? Mara said. It came out quieter than she intended, less guarded, the genuine question underneath all the careful ones. Why do you keep coming back here? The food isn't there are closer stops. Better paid cooks in Laramie who... It's not about closer, Cole said. It's not about better paid. He sat down, not because he was dismissing her, but because he was settling in for an honest answer, and honest answers took a moment to get right. I came back the second time because the biscuits were extraordinary, and I couldn't explain them. I came back the third time because I'd started to think about the person who made them, and every time after that... He stopped, started again. Because you're the most capable, most overlooked person in a 40-mile radius. And I've built a career noticing what's undervalued, and I find that I can't stop noticing you. The room was very quiet. Denny had stopped moving, was very carefully not looking at either of them. Mara stood with her hands at her sides and breathed through the impact of what had just been said, which was significant, which was the most direct and unornamented true thing anyone had said to her in... She didn't count the years because the number would have undone her. You don't know me, she said. No, he said. That's why I keep coming back. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, dinner's in an hour, and went back into the kitchen. It was not a rejection. Both of them understood that clearly. The conversation that broke something open happened on a Wednesday. A quiet day, sleet, keeping the trail riders and only Cole and a single elderly land agent at the far table, who was focused entirely on his paperwork and a bowl of soup. Cole had been there an hour when he heard the sound from the kitchen. Not a crash. Something smaller and worse than a crash. The specific sound of something being set down very carefully by someone who was right at the edge of their composure. And then, briefly, nothing at all. He was out of his chair before he decided to move. He stopped at the partition. Miss Whitfield. Silence. Mara. It was the first time he'd used her name. She heard the difference, and so did he. I'm fine, she said from somewhere behind the partition. Her voice doing the work of someone making a controlled surface out of something that wasn't controlled at all. You're not, he said. And you don't have to be. A long pause. Then quietly, with the restraint of someone who had kept the lid on something for so long that the habit of keeping it was almost stronger than the thing itself. He's cutting my hours in January. Pruitt says the winter traffic won't support full kitchen operations. He wants me available mornings and evenings, only no midday. A beat. He said it like he was doing me a kindness, like having fewer hours was something I should be grateful for. Cole said nothing. He listened. I have rent on the room. I have the supply costs. He doesn't cover the good spices, the preserves jars. She stopped. I have been managing very precisely Mr. Mercer, very carefully. And if he cuts the hours, the wage goes down with it, and the math doesn't... She stopped again. The math doesn't work. Cole leaned against the partition frame. How long have you been managing precisely? 2 years. And before Red Creek? Longer. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're good enough to run your own kitchen. You know that. Knowing it and having the means for it are different things. Yes, he said. They are. He paused. I have a ranch house kitchen that hasn't been properly run since I bought the place. I have 12 men who are tired of bad stew and worse bread. I have a cast iron stove with a good draft and a flour budget that's bigger than what Pruitt's paying you, and a room in the main house that's been empty since my foreman moved to the bunkhouse last spring. The silence that followed this was not empty. That's a job offer, Mara said. Yes. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a kitchen you can actually control, Cole said carefully. A budget that makes sense. A room that's yours. And this part matters. I'm not Pruitt. I don't leave notes on shelves. I don't take your wage down because the month was soft. I don't—" He stopped. "I pay what the work is worth. I always have. And your work is worth considerably more than what you're receiving." Another silence. Longer. The quality of it was different from the others. This one had thinking in it. Real thinking, the sound of someone running numbers and risks and trusts simultaneously. "You barely know me," she said again. "I know you're organized," he said. "I know you're inventive. I know you work when no one's watching the same as when they are. I know you make the best bread I've had in my adult life, and I know you don't waste emotion or an ingredient. For a ranch kitchen, that's everything I need to know. And the other things you don't know. I figure they'll come clear," he said quietly, "if you give them time to." Silence. "I need to think," she said. "Take whatever time you need." "I might say no." "I know," he said. "That's your right." A pause. Then, very quietly, not quite to him, almost to herself, "No one's offered me a right in a while." He didn't answer that. Some things didn't need an answer. Some things needed to be received and held, and allowed to mean what they meant, without a man's voice filling in over the top of them. He went back to his table. He finished his coffee. He left without asking again. She thought about it for 6 days. Not continuously. She couldn't afford continuous. She had bread to make, and meals to run, and a kitchen to manage at 5:30 every morning. But in the spaces between those things, in the hour before dawn, when she fed the sourdough starter and talked to it under her breath in the narrow dark of her room at night, when the station creaked around her in the cold, she thought about Cole Mercer and his cast-iron stove and the room that was empty in the main house. She thought about trust. She'd had reasons not to extend it. Good reasons, historical reasons, the kind that accumulate over years in the particular way that disappointments do silently, until they have filled in the whole space where openness used to live. She thought about the door hinge, the woodpile, the cardamom, the way he had said Mara at the partition, not casual, not proprietary, just her name, specific and deliberate, the way you say something when you mean it for the particular person, and not just for any person. She thought about Pruitt's voice the previous week. "You're a cook, Miss Whitfield, not a partner." She thought about 2 more years of that. 3. The math that didn't work. The sourdough starter sitting in its clay crock 16 years old. Her mother's hands all through it, surviving one difficult winter after another, because someone tended it faithfully. On the 6th day, Pruitt called her into the front hall and told her with the comfortable authority of a man who expected no argument that he was also suspending the supply budget for specialty items in January. No more quality spices, no more good vinegar. Whatever the freight shipments brought, she would use and be grateful. He waited for her to say yes, sir. She looked at him. She said, "I'll need to discuss my departure timeline." Pruitt stared at her. The word departure appeared to land with the impact of something entirely unexpected, which told Mara with stark clarity that he had never seriously considered the possibility that she might leave. She was a piece of the kitchen. Kitchens didn't leave. "I beg your pardon," he said. "My departure," she said, with the calm of someone who had made a decision 6 days ago and had simply been waiting for the moment to deliver it. "I'll work through the end of the month, which gives you time to make other arrangements. That's reasonable notice." Pruitt's face went through several stages in rapid succession. Surprise, followed by the blustering rebuilding of authority, followed by a calculation she could see clearly, which was how much trouble will this cause me. "Now see here, Miss Whitfield, if this is about the January budget." "It's about several things," she said. "But the conversation doesn't need to be long. I'll finish the month. You'll have time to find someone. We can part without difficulty." "You'll not find better terms anywhere in the territory," Pruitt said, and the confidence with which he said it was so absolute, so entirely unexamined, that Mara felt something shift in her, not anger, something cleaner. The specific sensation of no longer having to manage around someone else's ignorance of your value. "I expect that's what you believe," she said. "I'll finish the month." She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove for a moment. She realized her hands were steady. She had expected them to shake. They were completely steady. She fed the sourdough starter and thought about a cast-iron stove with a good draft and a room that was hers, and a man who had come back 9 times 10 now because he saw something worth coming back for. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the shelf where she kept supply lists, wrote 4 words at the top. Mercer Ridge, end of month. She folded the paper, gave it to Denny with instructions to pass it to the man at table 3 when he came in on Thursday. If he came in on Thursday. He came in on Thursday. She heard Denny murmur to him, heard the brief silence, heard the paper being unfolded and the longer silence that followed. She stood at her stove and waited, her hands working through the bread fold, her breath slow and deliberate and controlled. Then Cole Mercer's voice came from the other side of the partition, quiet and carrying something in it that she recognized only because she had felt the same thing herself 6 days ago. The specific quality of relief that a person experiences when something they had feared might not be true turns out to be true after all. Thursday, he said. I'll bring the wagon. Mara pressed her palms into the dough. Thursday, she said, and for the first time in 2 years, 4 months and 28 days, the number in her head stopped counting. Thursday came with a hard frost and a sky the color of iron. Mara was packed before Cole arrived. Not much to pack: 2 dresses, a winter coat that had been mended at both elbows, a small tin of her own spices she'd bought with money Pruitt didn't know about, and the sourdough starter in its clay crock wrapped in flannel and nested inside a wooden box she'd lined with straw. She carried the box herself. She didn't let Denny touch it. She didn't let Cole touch it either when he came through the kitchen entrance with his hat in his hands and looked at her standing there with everything she owned gathered into one small pile. He looked at the box first, then at her. Sourdough, she said by way of explanation. I figured, he said. He didn't offer to take it. He'd already learned something about what she would and wouldn't accept. Instead, he said, wagon's out front. Take whatever time you need. She didn't need any time. She picked up her bag with one hand and the wooden box with the other and walked out of the Red Creek kitchen without looking back at the stove, the shelf of jars, the hook where her apron had hung for 2 years and 5 months. She had said her goodbyes to those things privately in the dark of the previous night, and she was done with them. Pruitt was not in evidence. She had not expected him to be. Men like Pruitt didn't witness departures. Departures implied someone had made a choice, and choices implied value, and Pruitt was not prepared to confront the value of what he was losing. She suspected he would understand it in about 4 days when the next batch of biscuits came out of that kitchen, and they were not the same. She climbed onto the wagon seat. Cole clicked the horses forward. They rode the first mile in silence, which suited both of them. The road was frozen hard, and the wagon moved without difficulty, the horses steady and well matched. Mara held the wooden box in her lap with both hands and watched the trail ahead, and breathed the cold air and tried to identify what she was feeling. Not fear. She'd expected fear. What was there instead was something more like the particular alertness of a person stepping onto new ground, careful, attentive, not yet committed to any feeling about the new ground until she'd had the chance to test it. Tell me about the kitchen, she said after the second mile. Cole told her. Cast iron range well maintained, he kept it blacked in the fall. Good draft, as he'd said. 2 prep counters, one longer than the other. A cold box off the back wall, not a proper icebox, but well insulated. Pantry shelving he'd had built 3 years ago, when he'd still hoped someone competent would come along to use it. What's in the pantry now? She asked. Flour, some salt, a great deal of tinned beans that nobody wants to eat anymore, some cornmeal. He paused. Bard's stew supplies. Which are whatever Bard thought was a good idea at the time. When did Bard last think something was a good idea at the time? The corner of his mouth moved. Fair question. I'll need to do a full inventory, she said, and I'll need a supply budget in writing from the start. What I can order, what the cycle is, who I talk to in Rollins. I'll write it up tonight. And I'll run the kitchen on my terms, she said. Not aggressive. Just clear the way a person states a fact they have no intention of revisiting. Mealtimes portions menu, that's mine. I'll work within the budget, and I'll account for every cent, but I won't have the ranch hands second-guessing the cook or going around me to you to complain about what's on the table. Agreed, Cole said without hesitation. She looked at him. The quickness of it surprised her. She'd prepared for negotiation. Just like that. A person who manages a kitchen needs to manage it, he said. Otherwise, you don't have a cook. You have a committee, and committees don't produce biscuits like yours. She faced forward again. No, they don't. Mercer Ridge came into view in the early afternoon, a cluster of buildings set against a long tree line. The main house, substantial 2 stories. The bunkhouse beyond it, corrals to the east. Mara took it in with the same methodical attention she gave everything. Noting what she could determine from a distance, a working operation well maintained. Nothing flashy, the kind of place built by someone who had thought about function over appearance and had been right to do so. 3 men were visible near the corrals. They stopped what they were doing when the wagon came up the drive. She felt their attention, without meeting their eyes, the specific weight of scrutiny that goes around a stranger, particularly a woman arriving on the boss's wagon with a wooden box in her lap. She kept her chin level and her eyes on the house. Cole brought the wagon up, set the brake climb down, and then turned to offer his hand. She took it practical, not sentimental. She needed the step, and he was there, and came down onto the frozen ground with the wooden box tucked under her arm. One of the hands near the corral, a wiry man in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades making the outdoors his enemy, called out. "That the new cook, Miss Whitfield?" Cole said. "Show some manners, Bard." The wiry man Bard looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who had not been told to be subtle about it. He looked at the wooden box. He looked at her hands, her coat, her posture. He looked at Cole. Then he turned back to the corral and said nothing. Mara noted this. She filed it. Cole brought her through the main house to the kitchen and opened the door and stood aside. She walked in. She stood in the middle of it for 60 seconds, turning slowly, taking an inventory that had nothing to do with pantry shelves. She was reading the room the way she always read a new kitchen, not for what it was, but for what it could be, what the bones of it suggested where the problems were hiding, and how serious they'd prove to be. The range was as Cole had described. Good bones needed cleaning, but the firebox was sound and the surface had been maintained. The prep counters were adequate. The cold box was better than she'd expected. The pantry, when she opened it, was Bard stew supplies, Cole said from the doorway, reading her expression. "I see that," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," she said. "Just make sure the first order from Rollins gets here by the end of the week." "I'll ride out tomorrow." She set the wooden box on the highest pantry shelf, the safest spot away from the heat of the range, and unwrapped the sourdough starter and checked it with the focused attention of a doctor checking a pulse. The cold of the ride hadn't hurt it. She exhaled slowly and covered it back up. "Is it all right?" Cole asked. She looked over her shoulder at him. He was watching the process with what appeared to be genuine concern, which was not something she'd expected from a rancher confronted with a jar of fermented flour paste. "It's fine," she said. "It's survived harder trips than this." "What is it exactly?" "My mother started it 16 years ago," Mara said. "Rye flour and well water in Kansas. Every batch of bread I've ever made has had some of it in it." She paused. "It's the oldest thing I own." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll keep it safe," he said simply, and went to see to the horses. Mara stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the ranch around her. The horses, the men, the wind off the eastern ridgeline, the creak of the main house settling in the cold. It was noisier than Red Creek had been, fuller. There was more life in the walls. She put her apron on. She went to work. The first meal she made for Mercer Ridge was supper that night. Roast beef from the larder, properly seasoned with root vegetables, done the way they should be done, and not the way Bard had been doing them, which she could deduce from the scorched pan residue she'd cleaned off the range. And bread. Sourdough, her first batch in the new kitchen, made from what she had, and not yet from what she'd ordered, because she'd identified 3 things in the pantry that Bard had overlooked entirely. She heard them come in to eat. The scrape of boots. The low voices, the general sounds of men who had done physical work all day and wanted their food and their quiet and not much else. Then the voices changed, not dramatically, but she heard the shift the way conversation at a table shifts when food arrives that is different from what was expected. A pause. A particular kind of quiet. And then a comment from somewhere at the far end. "Hell is this?" Another voice. "Just eat it, Cutter." And then, for a long stretch, nothing but the sounds of eating. Mara stood in the kitchen and breathed. When Denny, no, not Denny, she corrected herself. There was no Denny here. The boy who cleared was a young ranch hand named Eli with big ears and a serious face. When Eli came back with the empty plates, she noted how empty they were, all of them. Clean wiped, empty, the kind of empty that says something without words. She allowed herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. Then she made a list of everything the pantry needed. The trouble with Bard started on the second day, and it started as most trouble does over something small. He came into the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, her kitchen already running at full operation. Bread in the oven, coffee on the range, doing precisely what she needed it to do, and went straight to the cold box and opened it with the proprietary ease of a man who had been doing so without question for years. "Morning," Mara said without turning from the stove. "The cold box stays closed until I've done the morning count." Bard stopped. "I need the leftover beef for the trail crew." "There isn't leftover beef. I used what remained for the stock. I'll have eggs and bread for the trail crew in 20 minutes, which is faster than cold beef would serve them anyway." A pause. She could feel him looking at her back. "Lady." He said, not mean exactly, but with a particular drawl that put her very firmly in a category that was not professional colleague. "I've been running provisions for this crew for 4 years. And I've been running this kitchen for 1 day, she said, still not turning. "Give me a week and we'll see which system works better. In the meantime, close the cold box." The cold box closed. She heard him go. She continued making breakfast and did not congratulate herself because the skirmish had been small, and she knew Bard well enough already to know that the real engagement was coming. It came that afternoon. 3 of the hands came to the kitchen door, not Bard, but men she'd identified as in his orbit, asking if there was anything to eat between meals. She'd expected this. At Red Creek, men had done the same, testing limits, seeing what could be extracted. "Supper's at 6, she said. "If a man's working hard and needs something to get through, I'll keep biscuits on the shelf. But I'm not running a boarding house counter. 6 o'clock. The men looked at each other. The youngest one, Cutter, she thought the one who'd said, "Hell is this," the night before, said, "Bard always let us." "Bard's not running this kitchen," Mara said pleasantly. 6 o'clock. They went. But that evening at supper, Bard sat at the head of the bunk table, his usual position, she was told, and said loud enough to carry through to the kitchen. "Used to be a man could get a biscuit when he needed one." Mara brought the bread out herself, set it on the table, looked at Bard directly, which she'd been deliberately not doing, because timing mattered and the moment had to be right. "Used to be," she agreed calmly. "Now there's enough bread at every meal that a man doesn't need to forage between them. Which means the bread's better. There's more of it, and nobody's eating cold scraps at 2 in the afternoon and ruining their appetite for supper." She paused. "If that's a worse arrangement, I'm open to hearing why." Silence. Bard looked at the bread. He was the first to take a piece. He said nothing further. But she felt the room recalibrate, not in her favor, not yet, but away from his, which for now was enough. Cole saw all of it and said nothing. This was Mara was beginning to understand his primary management philosophy: watch, assess, intervene only when necessary, trust capable people to manage capable person problems. It was different from Pruitt's approach in every conceivable way, and she was still adjusting to the strangeness of being trusted. On the 4th evening, he appeared at the kitchen doorway while she was doing the final cleanup. This had become a quiet pattern. He checked in last after the men were settled, not intrusively, just present. "Bard's coming around," he said. "Bard's smart," she said. "He knows the food is better. He doesn't like that it took a woman to make it better. Those two facts are in conflict and he's working it out. Does it bother you?" She considered this honestly. "No, I've dealt with men like Bard before. He's not mean, he's territorial. Those are different problems with different solutions." "What's the solution for territorial? Time and better food," she said. "Same solution as most problems." Cole almost smiled. She was getting better at recognizing the precursor, the slight shift around his eyes, before the actual smile arrived. "And if time and better food don't work, then I'll think of something else," she said. "I usually do." He leaned against the doorframe, and she was aware, not for the first time, of the particular quality of his presence in her space. Not intrusive, not performing, just there. The way a solid thing is there, without requiring you to account for it. "The men are talking about the bread," he said. "Talking how, the good kind of talking. Cutter told Eli this morning that he didn't know bread could taste like that. Eli said he thought it was because you were a witch." Cole's expression was perfectly serious. "I want you to know I did not confirm or deny." Mara stopped wiping the counter. "A witch." He meant it as a compliment. "He's 17. She went back to wiping, but the corner of her mouth had moved, and she knew he'd seen it. "17-year-old ranch hands are not my primary audience." "No?" Cole agreed. "I don't suppose they are." A pause. The kitchen was quiet, the range ticking as it cooled. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know you can answer honestly without it affecting anything about your position here." She looked at him. "Are you settled?" he said. "In the room, in the work. Are you, is this what you needed it to be?" It was a simple question. Direct, unornamented, the way he did everything. She thought about answering carefully, and then thought, this man drove 30 miles 9 times over 6 weeks because he believed she was worth the trip. He deserved a direct answer. "The kitchen is better than I expected," she said. "The room is the first space that's been entirely mine in years. The work is what I know how to do." She paused. "Ask me again in a month, and I'll give you a more complete answer." "Fair enough," he said. He left the doorway. She listened to his boots on the main house floor, the sound of him going back to his office, back to whatever work a rancher did at 9 in the evening. She stood in her kitchen, and held the word there for a moment. Then she went to the pantry shelf and fed the sourdough starter, talked to it a little, the way her mother had taught her. You need to be tended same as anything else worth keeping. The twist came on the 8th day, and it came from the last direction Mara had been watching. She'd been managing Bard. She'd been earning the younger hands. She'd been building her supply system, establishing her routines, learning the particular rhythms of a working ranch kitchen and how they differed from a way station, different timing, different volumes, different expectations. She had not been managing Nora Peasley. Nora Peasley was the wife of Cole's nearest neighbor, a woman in her mid-50s who arrived on the 8th morning with a covered dish and a smile that Mara recognized instantly and precisely because she had seen it before. The smile of someone arriving to assess a threat. "I heard Cole had taken on a cook," Nora said at the kitchen entrance, with the pleasant certainty of someone who had never been told she wasn't welcome anywhere. "I brought a pie. Dried apple. I always bring Cole a dried apple pie when the weather turns hard." She looked at Mara with that smile locked in place. "He does love it." Mara looked at the pie. She looked at Nora. She took both pieces of information in without any change in her expression. "That's kind of you," she said. "I'll make sure he gets it." Nora did not hand over the pie. "I thought I'd bring it through to the kitchen myself. I've always helped a bit around here when there wasn't anyone regular. Cole's a busy man. Someone has to see to things." "Someone does," Mara agreed. "That's why he hired me." She held out her hands for the pie, steady and patient, The way you hold out your hands for something that belongs in your keeping." Nora looked at those hands. Something moved through her expression, not meanness exactly, but a rapid and unfavorable reassessment. She handed over the pie. "I'll be sure to tell him you came," Mara said. She brought the pie inside. She set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment. She was not naive. She understood exactly what had been communicated in that exchange. A woman who had been tending a gap that Cole's life contained in her own way for whatever period of time, and who had arrived to determine whether the gap had been filled or merely covered. The kind of woman whose concern for a man's welfare had over time developed a particular possessiveness that the man himself might not have fully registered. Mara thought about that. She thought about it while she made lunch. She thought about it while she ran the afternoon prep. She thought about it with the specific, focused clarity of someone who had just identified a variable she hadn't included in her original calculation. She was not afraid of Nora Peasley. But she took her seriously, which was smarter than the alternative. That evening, when Cole came to the kitchen doorway, Mara said, "Nora Peasley brought a pie." "She does that," Cole said. He looked at the pie on the counter. "Dried apple. She always does love it," Mara said. "Yes," she mentioned. Something in his expression shifted, quickening a new attention. He looked at Mara more carefully. "Did she say something to you?" "She said several things to me," Mara said evenly. "All of them pleasant, all of them informative." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's been a neighbor for years. She's a good woman. I'm sure she is. She has certain ideas," he said carefully, "about what this place needs. What I need. I haven't—" He stopped. "I want to be clear about something." "You don't have to be," Mara said. "I do," he said. "Because you should know what you walked into, and I should have told you before you came." He looked at her steadily. "Nora has decided largely on her own that we suit each other. I have never encouraged that. I haven't always done enough to discourage it, which is its own failure. But it has no bearing on why I offered you this position, and no bearing on what I expect from you." He paused. "I don't want you to feel like you walked into something that wasn't what it was represented to be." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "I'm a cook," she said finally. "I came here to run a kitchen. That's what I'm doing." "Yes," he said. "Everything else," she said, "I can manage." He held her gaze, and in the quiet of the kitchen, with the range ticking and the night pressing against the windows and the sourdough starter sitting safe on its high shelf, something passed between them that neither of them named. Something that had been building for weeks across 30 miles of frozen road, and 9 trips to a way station and a hinge repaired before dawn. Not romance. Not yet. Not something so defined. Something earlier than that. Simpler and more dangerous. Recognition. He saw it. She saw that he saw it. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary, and then she turned back to the range. "The pie's on the counter," she said. "You should eat it before it goes dry." Cole stood in the doorway for a moment longer. "Mara," he said. She didn't turn. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." A pause. She could hear him considering. Then, "Good night, Miss Whitfield." His boots crossed the floor. His office door closed quietly. Mara stood at the range and pressed both palms flat against the warm iron surface and breathed. The kitchen was hers. The work was hers. The ground beneath her feet was steadier than any she'd stood on in years. She was not going to be invisible here. That much she was certain of. What she was not yet certain of, what she was only beginning carefully, guardedly, with every protective instinct she'd spent years developing. Now standing at full alert was whether the man on the other side of that office door was the reason the ground felt solid, or whether the ground was solid because she had finally, after 2 years and 5 months of counting, stopped waiting. She didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. The first month at Mercer Ridge passed, the way hard work always passes fast on the surface, and slow underneath each day, full enough that there was no room for doubt, but each night quiet enough that doubt found its way in anyway. Mara had learned the ranch's rhythms by the second week. She knew which hands ate fast and which ones lingered. She knew that Cutter, despite his initial suspicion, would eat anything she put in front of him with the uncritical devotion of a young man who had spent too long eating bad food and was now making up for lost time. She knew that the older hand named Gus had a bad tooth on the left side and quietly appreciated when the bread was soft enough not to punish him for it. She'd noticed him favoring one side at the table and adjusted without comment, and he hadn't said a word about it, but he'd started leaving the kitchen cleaner than he found it, which was his way of saying thank you. She knew that Bard ate everything on his plate, and then looked at the empty plate for a moment before setting it aside, the gesture of a man acknowledging something he hadn't expected to acknowledge. She knew Cole's schedule better than she knew anyone else's, which she told herself was practical. He ate early before the hands. He took his coffee black and his breakfast fast because the first 2 hours of a rancher's morning were the most critical, and he never wasted them. He came to the kitchen doorway in the evenings, not every evening, but most 4 or 5 times a week, and they talked in the particular way they'd developed, which was direct and brief and carried more between the lines than in them. She was building something here. She could feel it taking shape the way bread takes shape slowly with pressure, not visible until it was. And then, at the end of the 3rd week, Bard walked into her kitchen at 7 in the morning and said, "We've got a problem." He didn't sit. Bard was not a man who sat when he was troubled. He stood and moved and talked with his hands, and right now his hands were doing a lot. "Cattle count came in wrong this morning, east section. Mercer's been tracking it for a week and trying not to worry the men, but it's short. 30 head, maybe 35. Mara kept her hands moving on the dough she was working. 30 head missing from the east section. Missing or taken, Bard said. 2 different things with 2 different sets of trouble. She looked up at him. Which does Cole think it is? He's not saying, but he rode out at first light alone, which means he's not saying because he doesn't want anyone to hear the answer yet. Bard sat down finally on the stool near the prep counter, which was something he'd never done before. Man doesn't ride the east section alone at first light, unless he's worried about what his face is going to do when he finds out. Mara set the dough aside and cleaned her hands and said, "How long has the count been off?" "Best we can tell 10 days, maybe 12. "That's a long time for 30 head to wander." "Yes," Bard said. "It is." She looked at him steadily. They had reached over the course of 3 weeks, a working respect, not warmth, not yet, but the solid professional regard of 2 people who had tested each other and arrived at a fair accounting. He was here in her kitchen, telling her this before the hands were up, because somewhere in the last 3 weeks she had moved from interloper to someone he'd talk to when something needed thinking through. She recognized the shift and didn't comment on it. Some things got stronger when you didn't look directly at them. "Make sure breakfast is ready early," she said. "The men will need to eat before Cole gets back so they're not sitting idle when he comes in with news." She paused. "And make sure the coffee is strong this morning, Bard. This sounds like a strong coffee morning." Bard looked at her. Then he stood, and he did something she hadn't expected. He nodded. A real nod, not a grudging one. "Yeah," he said. "It does." He went. Mara stood in the kitchen and thought about 30 missing cattle and a man riding the east section alone at first light, and the particular kind of trouble that came when livestock disappeared in organized numbers over organized time. She thought about who benefited from that kind of trouble. She didn't like the shape of what she was thinking. Cole came back at 9:30 with mud on his boots and a look on his face that she'd never seen before. Not anger she'd have recognized. This was something more controlled and therefore more serious. The expression of a man who had found exactly what he feared and was now deciding very carefully what to do about it. He came through the kitchen without stopping, which he never did. He went straight to his office. The door didn't slam. Cole Mercer was not a door slammer, but it closed with a firmness that said everything. Mara finished the morning service. She cleaned the kitchen. She put together a plate of food he hadn't eaten, she'd watched him ride past, and a cup of coffee done right, and she walked to the office door and knocked. "Come," She went in and set the plate and cup on the corner of his desk, where the papers weren't, and stood. He looked at the plate, then at her. "You didn't have to do that." "You didn't eat this morning," she said. "Eat. Then tell me what you found if you want to tell me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the coffee. "Tracks," he said. "East fence line. Cut and restrung someone who knew what they were doing. Knew our rotation schedule, knew when the east section is lightest on riders." He set the cup down. This wasn't a wandering problem. This was a theft with planning behind it. How much planning? Enough to know we do a full count on the 1st and 15th. Enough to take 30 head in the window between counts and be over the territorial line before we noticed. He looked at the plate, but didn't eat. Someone with knowledge of this operation. The room was quiet. "A hand," Mara said. "I don't know. I don't want it to be. But I don't know." He rubbed his jaw. "I've sent Bard to track south. If they crossed into Gillette Range, we'll know by tomorrow. And if they crossed into Gillette Range," Mara said carefully, "what does that tell you?" Cole looked up at her. The look said, "You're asking the right question." "It tells me Frank Gillette has been running short since the summer drought and has a motivation I'd rather not think about in a man I've worked next to for 6 years. The name Gillette settled in the room, Mara thought. She thought with the same methodical attention she gave to a failing recipe back to the point of failure. What changed? What shouldn't have changed? "Nora Peasley," she said. Cole went very still. "What about her?" "She's a Gillette before she was a Peasley," Mara said. "Her brother is Frank Gillette." The silence that followed was of a specific quality she had learned to read in this man, the silence of something confirming a shape he'd already been afraid of. "How do you know that?" he said. "She told me," Mara said. "Second time she came by. She was talking about her family in the territory. She's proud of the connection." She paused. "I didn't know it was relevant until this morning." Cole stood. He went to the window, stood with his back to her, and she could see the particular tension in his shoulders of someone rearranging a map they thought they knew. "Nora knows this operation," he said quietly. "She's been in and out of this ranch for 3 years. She knows the count schedule. She knows the east section rotation." He stopped. "She wouldn't. Nora is not. People do things for family that they wouldn't do for themselves," Mara said, not unkindly. "Especially when the family is in trouble." Cole turned. He looked at her with the expression of a man confronting something he would have preferred not to be true. "This is not evidence," he said. "This is coincidence and proximity." "Yes," Mara said. "I know. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm thinking out loud. You should know what I'm thinking." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Most people don't think out loud to me." "Most people are afraid of the reaction," she said. "I'm not." Something shifted in his face. Not the precursor to a smile she'd learned to recognize. Something deeper and less comfortable than that. The expression of a man being seen more fully than he was accustomed to, and not entirely sure what to do about it. "Eat your breakfast," she said, and left him to it. Bard came back in this late afternoon with confirmation the tracks went south. They crossed the unmarked line between Mercer Ridge and Gillette Range, 3 miles below the east fence. He'd followed them far enough to count the approximate number, 3032, consistent with the missing head, before turning back. Cole called the hands together that evening, not a crisis meeting. He ran it too steady for that, his voice level. His eyes moving around the room, reading each face the way an experienced man reads weather. He told them what he knew. He told them he was handling it through proper channels, not through anger. He told them the east section rotation was changing effective immediately, and that nobody was to approach the Gillette line without him. The hands listened. Mara listened from the kitchen doorway. When Cole dismissed them, Cutter said, "Too young to know better." "What if Gillette just denies it?" Cole looked at him without any heat. "Then we prove it," he said. Quietly, correctly. "We prove it so thoroughly that denial isn't a useful option anymore. Cutter nodded. Gus caught Mara's eye across the room. He gave her a look that said, "This is the man he is. Worth knowing." She had already decided that, but it was useful to have it confirmed. The following morning, Nora Peasley came back. Mara was expecting her the way you expect a second winter storm after the first one. Not with certainty, but with the readiness of someone who has assessed the sky and made a reasonable calculation. She was at the range when she heard the knock at the kitchen entrance, and she went to the door and opened it, and there was Nora with her pleasant smile and her careful eyes and nothing in her hands this time. "I heard there was some trouble on the east section," Nora said. Mara looked at her. "Who told you?" A brief pause, barely a flicker. "Word travels. It's a small territory." "It is," Mara agreed. She didn't move away from the door. "Cole's in the east field this morning. He won't be back until noon." "I thought I'd wait," Nora said. "I wouldn't," Mara said pleasantly. "He'll be tired when he gets in, and he'll have work to do through the afternoon. Better to come another day." Nora's smile didn't move, but her eyes did a quick assessing shift, the look of a woman recalibrating. "You're very protective of his schedule, Miss Whitfield." "It's part of the job," Mara said. "Running a household means managing the demands on it." "A household," Nora said, and the word landed with a weight she'd put under it deliberately, as if to examine what it meant coming from Mara's mouth. "You've settled in quickly." "I'm good at my work," Mara said simply. "That tends to help." The two women looked at each other across the threshold. It was not unfriendly. It was not warm. It was the clear-eyed regard of two people who understood each other completely and were choosing for now civility. "Tell him I came," Nora said. "I will," Mara said, and closed the door gently with finality. She stood at the closed door for a moment. Then she went back to the range and made a mental note of the time 7:45 in the morning, and the fact that Nora Peasley had known about the East Section trouble before Cole had told anyone outside the ranch. She filed that note in the same place she filed all her important information in the back of her mind, where things kept until they became relevant. 2 days later, Cole sat down at the kitchen table, not the doorway, the actual table, which he hadn't done before, and spread 3 papers across the surface and said without preamble, "I need a second set of eyes." Mara dried her hands and sat across from him. The papers were receipts. Livestock transfer receipts, territorial registration stamps, dates going back 6 months. Cole spread them in order and walked her through it, a series of cattle sales registered under a subsidiary brand. Not Gillette outright, but a smaller operation registered 2 counties over, that Bard had traced with some careful inquiry back to Frank Gillette through a cousin's name. "He's been liquidating," Cole said. "Small batches, different buyers, spreading it so no single sale looks significant." He put his finger on a date. "This one is 2 weeks after the drought hit his south range." He started there. Mara studied the papers. She had no formal legal training. She had, however, spent 2 years managing Red Creek's supply accounts, under a man who cut corners and shifted numbers, and thought no one was paying enough attention to notice. She had noticed. She had learned out of sheer self-preservation how falsified accounts looked and felt. She picked up the second receipt, looked at the registration stamp. "This stamp is Laramie County," she said. "Right, he registered the subsidiary there. But this receipt shows a sale in Carbon County same week." She set both papers side by side. "He can't have been in both counties in 3 days with cattle, not with this volume." Cole looked at the papers, then at her. "You're right. The registration stamp is backdated," she said. "Or the sale receipt is. One of these documents isn't accurate." Cole sat back. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine surprise, not dramatic. Just a quality of stillness, like a man pausing to recalibrate. "How do you see that?" "Pruitt used to do something similar with the supply invoices," she said. "Shift dates to balance the periods. I learned what it looked like." She paused. "You should take these to the Territorial Land Office. They'll have the official registration records. If this stamp date doesn't match their records, That's not a civil matter anymore." Cole looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You are not what I hired." She met his eyes. "I'm exactly what you hired. I hired a cook," he said. He gestured at the papers, at her, at all of it, with a small motion that was somehow more eloquent than a longer one would have been. Something considerably more than that. "You got someone who pays attention," she said. "That's all." "That's everything," he said. Not lightly. With the weight of a man who has spent years in a world where good attention is the scarcest possible resource and has just found an unexpected supply of it. Mara looked back at the papers, so she didn't have to manage her expression. "Take them to Laramie," she said, "before Gillette has reason to think you're looking." "I'll go tomorrow," Cole said. He gathered the papers and stood. He was at the kitchen doorway before she said, without planning, to Cole. He stopped. She'd used his first name. She hadn't done that before, not directly, not out loud. He turned. "Be careful," she said. Not an instruction, not quite a plea. Something in between the specific weight of a concern offered by someone who has decided the person is worth being concerned about. He held her eyes for a moment. "I will," he said. He went. Mara sat at the kitchen table with the rectangle of papers gone from the surface, and nothing left but the wood grain and the morning light and the sound of the ranch going on around her. She sat with the feeling that had just moved through the room, the thing that happened when she said his name. And he turned, and neither of them made it more than it was, and both of them knew it was something. After a while, she got up and made lunch. Cole was gone for 2 days. The first day was fine. Mara ran the kitchen, managed the hands, answered Bard's questions about the east rotation, and did not check the drive twice in 1 hour. She checked it 3 times and was annoyed at herself and checked it again. The second evening, Cutter came to the kitchen door with the direct tactlessness of a 17-year-old and said, "You waiting on the boss?" "I'm doing the evening prep," Mara said. "Which you're interrupting. He'll be back," Cutter said with the unfounded confidence of youth. "Cole always comes back." "I'm aware of that," Mara said. "Go away, Cutter." Cutter went away grinning. Mara went back to the range and told herself she was not waiting. Cole came back on the second night late, well after supper. She heard the horse in the yard and heard Bard come out to meet him and heard their voices low for a few minutes and then boots on the main house steps and the front door. She was in the kitchen. She had, by some coincidence that she was not going to examine, not yet gone to bed. He came to the kitchen doorway. He looked tired in a productive way, the tiredness of someone who had done something and finished it. "The land office confirmed it," he said. "The registration stamp was falsified. The dates don't match." He leaned against the frame. "The territorial marshal has it now. Gillette will have a conversation to attend within the week." Mara let out a slow breath. "And the cattle?" "If they can be traced as mine, they'll come back. Some of them will be traceable." He paused. "Not all. Gillette's moved fast, but enough." She nodded. "Mara," he said. Those papers would have sat on my desk for a week while I looked at the obvious thing and missed the dates." He said it simply, not as flattery, as a statement of fact. "I would have gone to Gillette directly and made a mess of it. You saw what I didn't see." "You would have gotten there," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Slower, with more damage." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know I understand what you did. Not just the papers, all of it. Nora at the door, Bard in the kitchen that first morning, all of it. I see it." The last 3 words landed with a particular weight. She looked up at him. "I see it." The thing she had not had at Red Creek. The thing she had not had in Harlow's Crossing. The thing she had stopped expecting as a matter of rational self-protection and had then received anyway incrementally over the course of months from a man who drove 30 miles 9 times because he believed something was worth the trip. She held his gaze for longer than she had before. Something was different in the room tonight. The familiar precursor to the smile was there but deeper weighted differently. Not the easy near smile of a man amused, but the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. "I have a question," she said. "All right. When you came back the second time to Red Creek, you told yourself it was the road that saved half a day." He didn't look away. "Yes. When did you stop telling yourself that?" A pause. A real one. Not evasion, just honesty taking the time it needed. "Third visit," he said. "Maybe the second. I stopped telling myself things that weren't true somewhere around the time I started noticing how you moved through a room that wasn't looking at you." The kitchen was quiet. "You were looking," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was." She turned back to the range because she needed something to do with her hands, and also because if she kept looking at him, she was going to arrive somewhere she wasn't quite ready for, and she preferred to arrive at important places in her own time. "There's bread from this morning," she said, "and the soup's been on low. Sit down and eat something." He sat. She served him without ceremony, the way she did everything purposefully, without drama, as an act of attention. She poured coffee. She put the bread within reach. She stood at the counter and ate the small portion she'd kept for herself, and they ate in the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill the space between them with noise. Outside the ranch settled into night. The men were in the bunkhouse. The horses were quiet. The wind moved off the eastern ridgeline and found nothing to disturb. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. "I'd like to ask you to stay," he said. "Not just through the season. I'd like to ask you to stay on." She looked at him steadily. She took the full measure of what was being said, not just the words which were about employment, but the weight behind them, which was about something else entirely. Something neither of them was quite naming yet, but both of them were looking directly at. "I'm not done with the pantry reorganization," she said. He waited. "Or the summer supply schedule," she said. "I'd want to rebuild that from scratch." He waited. "And the sourdough starter needs at least another month before it's fully adjusted to the altitude here," she said. "I'd hate to leave before it's settled." A pause. "Those sound like reasons to stay," Cole said. "They are," she said. She picked up the plates and brought them to the basin and began to clean them, and she was aware of the warmth that moved through her chest. Not fire, not the dramatic thing, but something steadier and more lasting than fire. The warmth of a place that was hers, of work that mattered, of a man at her table who had come 30 miles 9 times because he saw something worth seeing and had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. She had been invisible for 2 years and 5 months. She was not invisible here. She was for the first time in longer than she could honestly calculate exactly where she had decided to be. The sourdough starter sat on its high shelf, 16 years old. Her mother's hands all through it, and it was alive, and it was fed, and it was exactly where it needed to be. Same as her. The week after Cole came back from Laramie, the ranch changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. But Mara felt it the way she felt changes in bread dough through her hands, through the specific texture of things, through the 100 small signals that a person learns to read when they have been paying close attention long enough. The hands were easier with her. Gus started leaving the wood stacked near the kitchen entrance again, without being asked, a habit he'd let drop during the tension of the cattle trouble. Cutter started timing his appearances at the kitchen doorway with the transparent opportunism of a young man who had discovered that the cook occasionally had something extra to offer if he showed up looking useful. Even Bard, in his way, had shifted, not warm, never exactly warm, but direct. Now the kind of directness that only gets extended to people who have been fully admitted into the circle of someone's regard. And Cole. Cole was different in a way she was still learning to name. He still came to the kitchen doorway in the evenings, but the doorway itself had changed. He stood differently in it, less like a man checking a room, and more like a man arriving at something. He stayed longer. The conversations went further. He told her things about the ranch she hadn't asked about, plans, concerns, the specific texture of a rancher's long-range thinking, with the ease of someone who had been storing those things for a long time and had finally found someone worth telling. She told him things too. She hadn't expected that part. She'd expected to listen, which she was good at, and to manage, which she was better at. She hadn't expected to find herself telling him one evening in late January about Harlow's Crossing, the winter the seamstress job, the arithmetic that didn't work. She hadn't planned to tell him. It came out during a conversation about something else entirely, and she heard herself saying it and didn't stop because he was listening with the quality of attention that made stopping feel like a waste. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a hard thing to carry alone." "I wasn't carrying it," she said. "I was just surviving it." "Sometimes those are the same thing," he said. She thought about that for days afterward. Nora Peasley came back on a Tuesday morning in the second week of February, and she came with her brother. Mara heard the horses in the yard, two of them, and looked through the kitchen at the sound, and felt something sharpen in her, the specific alertness of someone whose instincts have learned to trust themselves. She dried her hands. She stayed in the kitchen. She listened. Frank Gillette's voice carried. A big man's voice, the kind that expected rooms to accommodate it. She heard him in the front hall. Cole had let them in, which surprised her, until she remembered that Cole handled threats by meeting them head-on and at close range. "I'm not here for trouble," Gillette said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who had been on the wrong side of a legal situation for long enough to have adjusted his approach from aggression to negotiation. "I'm here because we're neighbors, and neighbors ought to settle things between themselves before the marshal gets further involved." Cole's voice came back level, quieter, but she could hear every word. "The marshal's already involved, Frank. That's not something we can unseal." "There are ways to handle these things quietly," Gillette said. "Restitution, agreed numbers. A man makes a hard decision in a hard year, and that shouldn't define 32 head," Cole said, "in organized batches, with falsified registration paperwork." A pause. "That's not a hard decision in a hard year. That's a plan." Silence from the hall. Nora's voice softer. "Cole, we've been neighbors 6 years. Surely there's—" "Nora." Cole's voice was not unkind, but it had a quality of finality that Mara had not heard from him before. Not the hardness of anger, but the hardness of a line drawn. "I know what you were doing. Coming to the kitchen, keeping track of the schedule. I don't think you knew it would go this far. But I think you knew something, and I think you know I know, and I'd like you to be honest with me about that right now." A very long silence. Then Nora quietly stripped of the pleasant smile Mara had always heard in her voice. "Frank was going to lose the South Range. 30 years, Cole. My family's had that land 30 years. "I know," Cole said. "He didn't think you'd notice for months. He said—" She stopped. "I didn't know about the papers. I didn't know he'd falsified anything. I told him your schedule. That's all I told him. I thought it was 30 head, and then he'd have enough to cover the banknote, and that would be the end of it." "But it wasn't the end of it," Cole said. "No," Nora said, very quietly. "It wasn't." In the kitchen, Mara stood completely still and listened to the specific sound of a woman understanding the full consequence of a thing she'd thought was small. It was a sound she recognized. She'd heard it in herself in the dark of the Red Creek bunkroom, understanding small by small the full shape of what Pruitt's management was costing her. Cole said, "Go home, Nora, both of you. The marshal will do what the marshal does, and that's not something I control anymore. But I won't make it worse, and I won't make it easier. That's all I can offer." Boots on the floor, the front door, horses in the yard moving away, silence in the main house. Then Cole's footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming toward the kitchen. He came through the doorway and looked at her. She looked at him. "You heard," he said. "Yes." He sat down at the kitchen table, heavy the weight of a man who has just closed something difficult and hasn't yet decided how he feels about being on the other side of it. 6 years, he said. "I thought I knew her." "You knew who she was when things were easy," Mara said. She sat across from him. "That's different from knowing who someone is when things get hard. Most people don't find out the difference until it's too late to do anything about it." He looked at her. "When did you get so clear-eyed about people 2 years at Red Creek?" she said. "You learn a lot about human nature when no one thinks you're paying attention." He made a sound, not a laugh exactly, but the breath of one short and genuine. "I imagine you do." "Frank Gillette will work something out with the marshal," she said. "Men like that usually do. It won't be nothing, but it won't be everything either." She paused. "And Nora. Nora made her choice," he said. "She'll have to live with it." He rubbed his hands on the table surface, a restless motion working something through. "What I can't figure is why I feel worse about Nora than about Frank. Frank stole from me. Nora just talked." "Because Frank was a stranger doing a stranger's wrong," Mara said. "Nora was someone you trusted doing a trusted person's wrong. Those are different sizes of thing." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She got up and poured coffee and put it in front of him and went back to the range because the morning prep wasn't done, and they stayed in the same room together without needing to fill it with anything more than the sounds of work and coffee and the particular comfort of two people who had reached a place where presence was enough. 3 days after the Gillette confrontation, Bard did something that stopped Mara in the middle of a sentence. She was giving him the week's supply list, a routine she'd established where she handed it over, and he took it to Rollins on the supply run, and he took the paper and looked at it, and then looked at her and said, "You put rosemary on here." "I did," she said. "For what?" "The lamb when we get the spring animals in, and the roast potatoes on Saturdays." "Bard, it's an herb, not a question." He looked at the list again. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the deliberate effort of a man for whom this kind of statement cost something. "The men are better this winter than they've been any winter I can remember. Not just the food, just better. Less fighting in the bunkhouse. Cutter stopped complaining about the cold." He folded the list. "I don't know if that's the food or just the change, but it's there." Mara looked at him. "Bard," she said. "Are you telling me I've done a good job?" He put the list in his coat pocket. "I'm telling you to put rosemary on the list," he said, and walked out. She stood in the kitchen and felt warmth move through her chest that had nothing to do with the range. Bard's acknowledgement, offered in the particular language of a man who had spent 40 years communicating primarily through practical action, landed with more weight than a formal compliment would have. She had earned his regard the only way she knew how, by doing the work consistently without theater, until the work spoke loudly enough that even a man determined not to listen couldn't ignore it anymore. She thought about what it had cost her to get here. The 2 years and 5 months at Red Creek. The winter in Harlow's Crossing. The careful management of small wages and impossible arithmetic. The invisibility that had become so total, she'd almost accepted it as her natural condition. She was not invisible at Mercer Ridge. She hadn't been for weeks now. But it still surprised her at odd moments, surprised her with the specific shock of warmth that comes when something you have gone without for a long time is suddenly simply available. The evening that changed everything, the final irreversible turn of the whole long story, came on a Friday in late February, cold and clear, the kind of night where the stars were so sharp they looked like they'd been cut. Mara was finishing the kitchen when she heard Cole come in from the evening check later than usual, the east section rotation still demanding more of his time than the theft had the kind of upstream problem that kept producing downstream work for months. She heard him at the wash basin, heard him stop in the hallway. Then he knocked at the kitchen door frame. Not his usual lean against it, an actual knock. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, not the rancher posture she'd learned to read, but something less composed, the posture of a man who has been working toward a moment and has finally arrived at it and is not entirely sure of the ground. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "I've been trying to figure out the right time," he said. "There probably isn't one. I've been waiting for there to be a right time, and I've decided waiting's not the strategy." She put down the cloth she was holding. She gave him her full attention. "When I first came to Red Creek," he said, "I told myself I went back for the biscuits, and that was true at first. The biscuits they are extraordinary." A pause. "But that stopped being the reason around the third visit, And I didn't acknowledge that to myself for longer than I should have, because I'm a practical man and I'm suspicious of things I can't account for practically. I know, she said. What I can't account for practically, he said, is the fact that this ranch runs better with you in it than it ever has without you. And not because the food is better, though it is, because... He stopped, looked at his hat, looked back up at her. Because I think better when you're here. I make better decisions. I see problems earlier. He stopped again, started again differently. I asked you to stay through the season, then I asked you to stay on. I want to ask you something different now. Mara stood very still. I want to ask if you'd consider staying, he said, not as the cook, not in any capacity that has a practical name. I want to ask if you'd consider staying because I would like you to. Because this place is because you are... He stopped and something crossed his face that she had never seen there, which was the specific unguardedness of a man who has run out of careful language and is down to the true thing. Because somewhere between October and now, I stopped being able to imagine this ranch without you in it. And I don't think that's a practical problem. I think that's a personal one. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Mara looked at him, at this man who had driven 30 miles 9 times, who had fixed her door hinge before dawn without announcing it, who had stacked her woodpile by dry and wet so she could reach what she needed in the cold, who had brought her cardamom because he'd noticed what she cared about, who had listened without filling, who had said, I see it, with the weight of someone who understood exactly what seeing cost, and exactly what not seeing had cost her. She said, Cole. He looked at her. The first time you came back, she said, I told myself it was just a man who liked good food. The second time, I told myself the same thing. The third time, she paused. The third time I stopped telling myself that. But I kept cooking as if I believed it, because believing the other thing it was a risk I didn't know how to calculate yet. And now, he said. She looked at him directly. Now I've been here 2 months, she said. I've seen who you are when things go right, and who you are when things go wrong, which is the only real way to know a person. I've watched you manage Bard and Cutter, and Gus, and Frank Gillette, and Nora Peasley, and you've done all of it the same way, honestly, and without cruelty, and with more patience than most men carry. She stopped. And you've never once, not once, made me feel like the work I do is less than what it is, or like the person doing it is less than what she is. Cole didn't move. That's rarer than you know, she said. That is the rarest thing I have ever been offered. He took 1 step into the kitchen. Not crossing the room, just closing the distance by 1 step, enough to make it clear he was moving toward her and intended to continue. Mara, he said, and her name in his voice had an entirely different quality than it had had on any of the previous occasions he'd used it. Warmer, more settled. The quality of something said not for the first time, but in its proper register at last. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I know, she said. Then you know, he said, that when I say I want you to stay, I'm not talking about the kitchen. I know, she said again. I've known for a while. He was 2 steps away. He stopped there and looked at her with the expression she'd watched develop over months, from the attentive stranger at Red Creek, to the man at the doorway, to whatever this was. This unguarded and specific and entirely real thing that was on his face right now, which was not the precursor to a smile. Which was the full thing. Which was the thing that had been building since October and had finally arrived at its own destination. What would you need, he said, to trust this? To trust... I already trust it, she said. I trusted the door hinge. A pause. Then the corner of his mouth moved, and the smile came, the real one, full and unhurried, the smile of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. The door hinge, he said. A man who fixes a hinge before dawn without asking for credit, she said, is a man worth trusting. He crossed the remaining distance. He stood in front of her close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to decline, and took her hand. Not the gesture of possession, but the gesture of offering his fingers closing around hers with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, the same quality of meaning it. She didn't decline. She held his hand and looked at him and felt not the explosion, not the dramatic thing the stories promised, but something truer and more durable than that. The specific warmth of finally being somewhere she had chosen, held by someone who had chosen her back, with her full knowledge, and her full consent, and her full self present to receive it. "I'll stay," she said, not because she had to, not because the arithmetic left no other option, because she wanted to. Because Mercer Ridge was hers now in the way that mattered not on paper, not by wage, but by the 100 daily acts of care and competence and presence that make a place into a home. He brought her hand up and held it between both of his, and they stood in the kitchen with the range ticking and the stars outside, and the ranch settled into its night sounds, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The spring came to Mercer Ridge with the particular extravagance of a Wyoming spring, fast cold one day, and suddenly warm the next, the ground releasing everything it had held through winter all at once. The cattle came back from the east section in better condition than expected. The territorial marshal's proceedings against Frank Gillette settled into the slow machinery of territorial law, and the South Range changed hands by April, not to Gillette and not to Mercer, but to a new family from Ohio who planted it differently. Nora Peasley moved to her daughter's house in Cheyenne. She did not come back to Mercer Ridge. Bard in March presented Mara with a new cold box he had built himself from specifications he'd asked her to draw out the previous month. Better insulated, better positioned, properly sized for the kitchen she'd been running all winter. He presented it without ceremony, the way he did everything, and she accepted it the same way, and that was the end of the longest negotiation she'd ever conducted without words. Cutter, who turned 18 in April, asked Mara with great seriousness if she would teach him to make bread. She looked at him for a moment, and then said yes, and he turned out to have decent hands for it, which surprised neither of them as much as it probably should have. Eli, the serious-faced young ranch hand, began keeping the kitchen cleaner than anyone asked him to, a habit that spread in the subtle way that good habits spread when someone with authority practices them without comment. And the sourdough starter, now fully adjusted to Mercer Ridge altitude, produced every morning in Mara's kitchen the bread that had started everything layered, slightly salted, almost sweet underneath, tended with the same faithfulness her mother had taught her, carrying 16 years of a life that had survived hard winters, because someone chose to keep tending it. It was an evening in late April. The ranch quiet supper done the kitchen clean, when Cole came in and sat at the table and watched her work through the last of the evening tasks with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in the room he was in. They had been like this for 2 months now, the particular domesticity of two people who had decided without drama and without ceremony that the other person was where they wanted to be. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. He was looking at her the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't watching, with the full, unguarded attention he'd been pointing at her since October, the attention that had seen her before she'd seen herself clearly, that had registered her worth in a room full of people who hadn't bothered. "What are you thinking?" she said. He picked up his coffee. "I was thinking about the first night I ate at Red Creek." He paused. "I sat at that table and I took one bite and He stopped. "I didn't know what I was going to do about it. I just knew I was going to do something." "You came back," she said. "9 times, he said. 10. 10, he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the Wyoming spring was doing what it did, moving fast, certain of itself, not waiting for anyone's permission. "Cole?" she said. "Ask me." He looked at her. He understood what she meant. She could see him understanding it. The recognition moving through his expression, with the same quality as everything else he'd ever done in her presence, which was with full attention and nothing held back. He set his coffee down. "Who baked these biscuits?" he said. Not a joke, not a reference. The real question, the one that had been underneath everything since October, since a man in a dusty way station took one bite and felt the ground shift under him and decided, without fully knowing why, that the ground was worth following. Mara looked at him across the kitchen table. The table that was hers in the kitchen, that was hers in the place she had chosen with her whole self present to make the choice. "I did," she said. "Same as everything else worth keeping in this kitchen." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know," he said. "I've known since October. I just needed you to know that I know." She held his hand and looked at this man who had seen her when no one else had bothered to look, who had driven 30 miles in frozen weather because good work deserved to be recognized. And a person behind good work deserved even more, who had fixed hinges and stacked wood and said her name like it mattered, and waited patiently with the steady certainty of a man who knew what he was looking at, until she was ready to believe that someone could look at her and see everything and still choose to stay. She had been invisible for 2 years, 5 months, and however many days. She was not invisible now. She was Mara Whitfield, and she was seen, and she was chosen, and she was exactly where she had decided to be, not saved, not rescued, not arranged into someone else's story. Present, capable, full, and known. The sourdough starter sat on its high shelf above the range, 16 years old, her mother's hands all through it, alive and tended and exactly where it needed to be. Cole Mercer held her hand across a kitchen table and looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking until the night he took one bite of extraordinary bread and understood without being able to explain it that the person who made it was someone he could not afford to ignore. He had been right, and Mara Whitfield, who had survived invisibility and bad arithmetic, and 2 winters alone, who had carried a 16-year-old starter across the territory in a flannel-wrapped crock and built something real out of every hard place she'd been given, looked back at him with clear eyes and an open hand. And for the first time in her life, being seen felt exactly like home.